What if I told you that before America built prisons, before it built police departments as we know them, before it invented surveillance cameras or predictive algorithms, it already had a system to monitor, control, and suppress black people? And what if I told you that this system never really went away? It simply evolved, changing faces and names, but keeping the same purpose: keeping black freedom under suspicion. From the 1700s to today's high-tech surveillance networks, the story is unbroken. And it begins in the most brutal of places, the slave patrol state. Many people assume surveillance of black people was just a southern problem. But let's start in the north, where the so-called free states had their own ways of keeping black bodies visible and controlled. In colonial New York, a law forced every black or indigenous person to carry a lit lantern if they walked unescorted after dark. Imagine that. Your very existence was illegal unless you carried a glowing beacon marking you out for all to see. A single forgotten lantern could mean whippings, jail, or worse. It was called a lantern law. But what it really was an early surveillance system. It turned the night into a spotlight, exposing black movement while white colonists slept secure. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of years before street cameras, New York had already made sure black presence was impossible to hide. Now shift south to South Carolina, 1704. Wealthy planters live in fear. Their economy depends entirely on enslaved Africans, who now outnumber whites in some areas. And the planters know the truth. No human being accepts bondage forever. So they create something new: the slave patrol. White men on horseback, armed with whips, guns, and the law itself, roamed the countryside. Their job was simple: to watch, stop, question, and punish black people. Any black person caught without a pass could be beaten, whipped, or jailed. But this was more than policing. Slave patrols could invade slave quarters without warning, break up gatherings, search for contraband, and terrorize families at will. They were America's first organized surveillance force. Let's be clear, before America built schools for every child, it built patrols to watch black people. Before it guaranteed freedom of speech, it guaranteed white men the right to stop and frisk enslaved Africans. Why such obsession? Because rebellion was always bubbling beneath the surface. In 1800, a blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser planned a massive revolt in Virginia. Hundreds were ready to rise with him. But a storm delayed the attack, and an informant betrayed him. Gabriel was captured, executed, and his dream of freedom crushed. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free black man in Charleston, organized what might have been the largest slave uprising in U.S. history. His plan: thousands of enslaved people would storm the city, seize ships, and sail to freedom in Haiti. But once again, betrayal struck. A coerced informant exposed the plan, leading to Vesey's arrest and execution, along with 34 of his followers. These betrayals revealed something vital. White power didn't just watch from the outside. It planted surveillance within black communities, forcing informants to spy on their own for survival. And so, from lantern laws in the north to slave patrols in the south, America made one truth clear: black existence was never private. Freedom itself was always treated as suspicious. But here's the question: what happens when slavery is finally abolished? Does the surveillance end? Does America set down its lanterns and patrols? The answer is chilling. Because in 1865, when the chains of slavery broke, America did not dismantle its system of control. Instead, it reinvents it. And the result is a new, more sinister form of surveillance that would make freedom itself a crime. Stay with me as we uncover how emancipation gave birth not to liberty, but to a new system of laws and prisons designed to watch, trap, and enslave black people all over again. The Emancipation Proclamation promised freedom. The 13th Amendment etched it into the Constitution. But for black people in America, freedom didn't mean safety. It meant new laws, new patrols, new eyes watching from every corner. Because when slavery ended in 1865, America faced a choice. It could rebuild as a nation of equals, or it could reinvent slavery in disguise. Guess which path it chose? This is the story of how emancipation gave birth not to liberty, but to the surveillance state of Reconstruction. Picture it. April 1865. The Civil War ends. Union soldiers march through southern cities, their flags raised high, their drums announcing a new era. Enslaved men and women drop tools in fields, leave plantations, and embrace each other with tears of joy. For the first time in centuries, they are no longer property. But while black communities celebrated, white America panicked. The Southern economy had been built entirely on slave labor. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free. To white elites, this wasn't just a loss of wealth. It was a threat. And so, even before the ink on the 13th Amendment dried, states began drafting new laws to keep black people under control. They weren't called slave codes anymore. Now they had a new name, the Black Codes. Mississippi moved first. In 1865, it passed one of the harshest sets of laws in American history. Any black person without proof of employment could be arrested for vagrancy. If they couldn't pay the fines, and most couldn't, they could be hired out to white employers. Black people were banned from renting or owning property in towns. Children could be taken from parents and apprenticed to white families, another word for forced labor. South Carolina followed quickly, requiring black men to pay a special tax if they worked outside of farming or domestic labor. In Louisiana, police had the right to arrest black people for violating curfews. In Alabama, interracial gatherings were outlawed. Freedom existed on paper, but in reality, black people's every move was watched, judged, and criminalized. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime. That single clause was the most devastating loophole in American history. It meant that all the state had to do was label a black person a criminal, and slavery could continue, perfectly legal. And that's exactly what they did. Once arrested under the Black Codes, black men, women, and even children were sent to prison. But Southern states had no intention of housing and feeding thousands of new prisoners. Instead, they created a system that was both cruel and profitable: convict leasing. Prisoners were leased to private companies, railroads, coal mines, and plantations. States collected the fees, while companies got free labor. The conditions were worse than slavery. On plantations, enslaved people had at least some value to their owners. But leased convicts? They could be worked to death and easily replaced. In Alabama, convicts leased to coal mines lived in filthy stockades, shackled in chains, forced to dig tunnels until they collapsed from exhaustion. In Texas, convicts picked cotton under armed watch, whipped if they slowed down. In Georgia, children as young as 12 were leased to turpentine camps, breathing in toxic fumes as they scraped pine trees for sap. Historian Douglas Blackman described it simply: it was slavery by another name. To understand the horror, let's look at one life. In 1908, a young black man named Green Cottenham was arrested in Alabama for vagrancy. His crime? Being unemployed. Within days, he was leased to U.S. Steel to work in a coal mine. Shackled, starved, and beaten, Cottenham labored underground in choking darkness. Disease spread quickly. Accidents were frequent. Within months, Cottenham was dead. And he was not alone. Thousands of men, just like him, were funneled into mines, railroads, and lumber camps. Some historians estimate that in Alabama alone, one prisoner died every 4 days under the convict leasing system. By the 1880s, convict leasing was a multi-million-dollar industry. In states like Alabama, convict leasing brought in up to 73% of total state revenue. Think about that. The government itself depended on keeping black people under constant watch, arresting them for the smallest infractions, and selling their labor. Surveillance wasn't just about control anymore. It was about money. Every arrest, every file, every name in the system was worth profit. And white society justified it with a dangerous lie: the myth of the black criminal. Newspapers portrayed newly freed black men as dangerous, lazy, and prone to crime. Politicians gave speeches warning of Negro lawlessness. It was propaganda designed to make surveillance feel like protection, when in reality, it was a continuation of slavery. Not all convicts were leased. Some were forced onto chain gangs. Imagine dozens of black men shackled together by iron chains, breaking rocks on dusty roads under the blazing sun. Guards stood nearby with rifles, barking orders. Passers-by, white families, children, would stop to watch, as though it were a form of entertainment. Chain gangs weren't just labor. They were a public reminder. Freedom had limits. Black people were never beyond the reach of white control. It's tempting to see this as a Southern problem. But the North had its own surveillance systems. Police departments in northern cities like New York and Chicago closely monitored black neighborhoods, often more heavily than white immigrant areas. Employment bureaus tracked the movements of black workers. Housing agencies kept detailed records of black families, who lived where, who rented, who moved. Surveillance was not just a Southern obsession. It was becoming part of the American way of governing. And yet, black people resisted. Freedmen schools opened across the South, teaching reading and writing, even though white mobs often burned them down. Black churches became places of gathering, worship, and political organizing, always under watchful white suspicion. Secret societies formed, protecting black workers from exploitation. Families fled chain gangs, escaped leasing camps, and disappeared into new towns, carving out hidden lives. But every act of resistance fueled white paranoia, and paranoia only fueled more surveillance. By the end of the 19th century, the black codes gave way to a new order, Jim Crow. Segregation laws divided schools, buses, restaurants, and public spaces. Poll taxes and literacy tests stripped away voting rights. Lynch mobs enforced terror. And behind it all was surveillance, sheriffs, deputies, and local officials keeping black people in their place through constant scrutiny. The system had evolved again. Slavery became black codes. Black codes became convict leasing. Convict leasing became Jim Crow. And through it all, black life was never private, never free from the overseer's gaze. By the dawn of the 20th century, America had perfected the art of criminalizing black life. The chains were hidden behind laws, the plantations disguised as prisons, and the whips replaced by badges. But something new was rising. Black leaders were beginning to emerge, men and women who dared to speak of pride, independence, and power on a mass scale. And when they did, the surveillance didn't just come from sheriffs or states. It came from Washington, from the FBI, from J. Edgar Hoover himself. We'll soon uncover how the federal government declared war on black leadership, from Marcus Garvey to Martin Luther King Jr., from Malcolm X to Fred Hampton, and how surveillance shifted from controlling bodies to controlling voices. Because when black people spoke of freedom too loudly, America made sure somebody was listening. If emancipation created prisons to re-enslave black people, then Jim Crow built an entire civilization of surveillance. From segregated neighborhoods and poll taxes to literacy tests and armed white mobs keeping count of the ballot box, every corner of life was watched, controlled, and restricted. But when black people began to rise anyway, when the civil rights movement caught fire, America escalated again. The government turned its most secretive tools against its own citizens. And at the center of this operation stood a program whose very name still chills those who know it, COINTELPRO. What you're about to hear is the story of how America treated black freedom not as a dream to honor, but as a threat to eliminate. After Reconstruction was strangled in the 1870s, the South invented a new system to keep black people under constant observation, Jim Crow. Segregation wasn't just about separate schools and water fountains. It was surveillance in disguise. Black people could only sit in certain train cars, eat at certain restaurants, live in certain neighborhoods. Their movements were restricted not by fences, but by laws and eyes. In towns across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, sheriffs enforced sundown laws. If a black person was caught outside after dark in the wrong area, they risked arrest, or worse, lynching. White mobs operated as an unofficial surveillance arm, making sure black people knew their place. Every bus ride, every ballot, every courthouse step was another checkpoint. Imagine being watched not by cameras, but by thousands of hostile eyes, trained from birth to read your skin as suspicious. This was the South's early surveillance state. But the North was not innocent. In cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, black migrants who fled Jim Crow were forced into red-line districts. Banks marked maps with red ink, refusing loans to anyone in black neighborhoods. Real estate boards and city planners tracked, mapped, and contained black life block by block. Jim Crow was a cage without bars, a system where every move was seen, measured, and punished. Meanwhile, in Washington, a young bureaucrat was building a machine of his own. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. In 1919, just after World War I, America faced the Red Summer, a season of black uprisings against white violence. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago, black veterans returned from the war unwilling to bow again to Jim Crow. They marched, they fought back, and they demanded rights. Hoover, then a 24-year-old Justice Department lawyer, saw this as a crisis. But he didn't blame the white mobs who had burned entire black neighborhoods to the ground. He blamed the victims. To Hoover, black resistance looked like radicalism, even Bolshevism. So he created files. Hundreds, then thousands of them. He tracked black leaders, churches, newspapers, and clubs. In his eyes, every black voice calling for dignity was a potential threat to national security. By the time Hoover became director of the FBI in 1924, those files had multiplied. For the rest of his nearly 50-year reign, Hoover built one of the largest surveillance machines in the world, one aimed not at criminals, but at black liberation itself. When the civil rights movement rose in the 1950s, Hoover was ready. From the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to the March on Washington in 1963, every major action was shadowed by federal eyes. Agents infiltrated NAACP chapters. They sat in black churches, pretending to be worshipers. They followed organizers' cars at night. The FBI's obsession wasn't just about information. It was about intimidation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became the #1 target. Hoover labeled him the most dangerous Negro in America. His crime? Believing that America should live up to its own promises. Agents bugged King's hotel rooms. They tapped his phones. They mailed him threatening letters, one so vile that it encouraged him to commit suicide before his Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. The FBI even tracked singers and celebrities like Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, and Paul Robeson, fearful that their voices might inspire the masses. To Hoover, every black artist, preacher, and student was a potential subversive. In 1956, Hoover made it official. The program was called the COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Its mission, to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize organizations considered dangerous. In reality, it became a declaration of war on black America. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI didn't just watch. It sabotaged. Agents planted informants inside groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, and later, the Black Panther Party. They sent forged letters to sow distrust. One letter convinced SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael that his comrades were plotting against him. They spread false rumors of affairs, theft, and betrayal. They even encouraged deadly rivalries. In one case, agents faked letters to spark conflict between the Panthers and another black nationalist group, leading to shootouts and deaths. This was not passive surveillance. It was active psychological warfare. No group faced the brunt of COINTELPRO like the Black Panther Party. Founded in Oakland in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers were bold. They patrolled neighborhoods with law books in one hand and shotguns in the other, monitoring police to prevent brutality. They fed thousands of children breakfast. They opened free medical clinics. They gave dignity where America gave neglect. But to Hoover, they were public enemy #1. The FBI infiltrated Panther chapters across the nation. Informants reported on every meeting. Agents harassed members' families, spread lies in the press, and staged raids with local police. In 1969, Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton, just 21 years old, was drugged by an FBI informant. That night, police stormed his apartment, firing nearly 100 shots. Hampton was killed in his bed, next to his pregnant fiancée. Official reports called it a shootout. But the truth was clear. It was an assassination, carried out under the banner of surveillance. COINTELPRO had achieved its goal, neutralization. For ordinary black people, this surveillance wasn't invisible. It was lived. Families knew their phones might be tapped. Activists whispered in code, assuming informants were in the room. People avoided meetings, fearing they'd be targeted next. Surveillance didn't just monitor movements. It fractured trust. It made neighbors suspicious of each other, splintered organizations, and drained movements of energy. And yet, despite all of this, the struggle continued. Civil rights laws were passed. Black power movements blossomed. Hip-hop rose from the ashes of broken neighborhoods, carrying the message forward. But the lesson of COINTELPRO lingered. When black people organize, America does not simply debate. It watches. It infiltrates. It destroys. By the 1970s, the FBI claimed COINTELPRO had ended. Officially, the files were closed, the operations shut down. But surveillance is a beast that never dies. It adapts. As technology advanced, so did the methods of control. Cameras replaced informants. Databases replaced filing cabinets. Satellites replaced wiretaps. And by the 1980s and 1990s, a new form of surveillance was rising, one fueled not by ideology, but by economics. The so-called war on drugs turned entire black neighborhoods into monitored zones. Police no longer just watched activists. They watched everyone. But how did America make that leap? From spying on leaders to criminalizing entire communities. And what hidden systems of surveillance still operate today under names like predictive policing and national security? That's the story we uncover next. In the next part, we'll step into the age of mass incarceration and digital surveillance, and reveal how the watchful eye that began with lantern laws now follows us through cameras, credit scores, and even algorithms. Stay with me. What if I told you that America's surveillance of black people didn't end with Jim Crow or COINTELPRO, but instead became invisible, woven into the very fabric of daily life? That the lantern laws, the slave patrols, and the FBI files all evolve into something more sophisticated, something harder to see, but even harder to escape? Because by the 1980s, surveillance no longer just targeted leaders or activists. It targeted whole communities. Entire neighborhoods became laboratories of control. And today, in the age of smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence, the watchful eye is closer, sharper, and more relentless than ever before. This is the story of how Black America went from being followed by men on horseback to being tracked by satellites, police databases, and algorithms. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs. To the public, it sounded like a battle against crime. But for Black America, it was something darker, a new form of surveillance and control. Suddenly, police were everywhere. Street corners, housing projects, schools, all became monitored zones. Helicopters circled neighborhoods and cities like Los Angeles and Detroit. Undercover officers posed as neighbors, friends, even lovers, only to entrap people and stage drug buys. Entire communities were placed under suspicion. The numbers tell the story. By the mid-1980s, stop-and-frisk tactics exploded. In New York City alone, hundreds of thousands of mostly Black and Latino men were stopped each year, searched without warrants, their names entered into databases, watched whether guilty of anything or not. The prison population soared, quadrupling in just 2 decades. And with it grew a vast surveillance bureaucracy, probation officers, parole boards, mandatory drug testing, ankle monitors. The system tracked not just those behind bars, but also those who left them. Freedom became conditional, watched, measured, always at risk of being revoked. The war on drugs didn't just police crime. It policed Black existence. The 1990s brought a new escalation. With 3 strikes, laws, and mandatory minimums, millions more were swept into prisons. But here's what's often overlooked. Prison wasn't just punishment. It was data collection. Every inmate had files, fingerprints, mugshots, medical records. DNA samples were stored. Phone calls were recorded. Letters were censored. Visits were monitored. Prisons became warehouses not just for bodies, but for information. And once released, that surveillance followed them. Ex-convict databases made it nearly impossible to get jobs. Stop and frisk kept their names in police logs. Voter suppression laws stripped away their voices. In many states, parole officers could search a home without a warrant. In effect, the prison system became a digital plantation, tracking, limiting, and exploiting Black life long after sentences were served. The rise of digital surveillance. By the early 2000s, America entered a new age, the age of digital surveillance. After the 9/11 attacks, the Patriot Act gave the government unprecedented powers. Phones could be tapped without warrants. Internet searches could be monitored. Emails could be scanned. But here's the hidden truth. While these tools were justified as anti-terror measures, they were quickly turned inward, back toward communities already marked as dangerous. Police departments across the country adopted new technologies. License plate readers scanning cars in black neighborhoods. ShotSpotter microphones installed in cities, picking up not just gunfire but conversations. Databases linking school attendance, welfare benefits, and court records into a single profile of risk. By the 2010s, cameras blanketed cities like Baltimore, Chicago, and New Orleans. Black children grew up under a lens, their playgrounds watched by surveillance towers, their social media posts tracked by police intelligence units. Freedom was no longer the absence of chains. It was the presence of cameras. Then came algorithms. Programs like PredPol claimed they could predict crime before it happened. Using past arrest data, they created heat maps of where police should patrol. But here's the catch. Those maps weren't neutral. They were built on decades of racially biased data. If a black neighborhood had been over-policed in the past, the algorithm flagged it again in the future. More patrols led to more arrests. More arrests fed more data. And the cycle repeated endlessly. In effect, predictive policing didn't forecast crime. It manufactured it. It turned poverty into suspicion, blackness into a statistic, neighborhoods into permanent zones of surveillance. Residents reported seeing squad cars circling daily, drones flying overhead, and social media accounts flagged by police cyber units. For many young black men, a Facebook post could bring a knock at the door. The algorithm wasn't a new tool. It was just the lantern law, reborn in digital code. What makes today's surveillance different is its invisibility. Consider this. When you use your phone, your location is tracked. When you apply for a loan, your credit score, built on biased financial systems, decides your fate. When you walk into a store, cameras powered by facial recognition scan your face, checking against databases you never consented to join. Studies show that facial recognition misidentifies black faces at alarming rates. Innocent people have been arrested because a computer confused them with someone else. Yet companies keep selling the software, and police keep buying it. Even schools aren't safe. Some districts now use facial recognition to monitor children. Others track attendance with RFID badges. In predominantly black and Latino schools, students are growing up under systems that treat them as suspects before they even graduate. Surveillance has become the water we swim in, so ordinary that we forget it's there. But for Black America, the stakes remain deadly. And yet, resistance continues. Civil rights lawyers are fighting back against predictive policing. Grassroots groups are demanding bans on facial recognition. Cities like San Francisco, Oakland, and Boston have already outlawed certain surveillance technologies, thanks to community pressure. Black activists use encryption apps, burner phones, and decentralized networks to protect themselves from state monitoring. Protesters cover their faces, turn off GPS, and use creative tactics to outsmart the digital gaze. Even in the age of algorithms, the struggle for privacy is a struggle for freedom. Because to be unseen, to move without permission, is itself an act of rebellion. Looking back across 400 years, the pattern is undeniable. From lantern laws forcing black people to carry lights at night, to slave patrols hunting fugitives, to Jim Crow laws marking every bus seat and ballot line, to FBI agents bugging hotel rooms and planting informants, to predictive algorithms circling black neighborhoods today, the Watchful has never closed. It has only adapted. This is not a coincidence. It is design. Because in America, black freedom has always been seen as a threat, and the response has always been surveillance. So the question is this: what happens next? If the lantern law became the algorithm, and the patrol became the drone, what will the next century bring? What will happen when artificial intelligence, biometric scanning, and even DNA mapping are deployed not in the name of safety, but in the name of control? That answer depends on us, on whether we expose the pattern, learn from it, and demand accountability before it's too late. Because history has shown us something chilling. The more powerful black voices rise, the sharper the eye becomes. But history also shows us something hopeful. No matter how tightly we are watched, freedom keeps finding a way to break through. And that's why we must keep telling these stories. If you've been with us through this journey, from lantern laws to algorithms, don't let this story disappear like so many others have. Subscribe to the channel, share this documentary, and join us in uncovering the hidden histories they want us to forget. Because the Watchful I may never close, but neither will the fight for freedom.